Welcome back. So, when we think about how the New Testament teaches us uh, resolution of serious conflict and chances of violence, um, we do have very important words of Jesus and the life of Jesus, which we cannot lose sight of. However, and we will come back to that, however, this is not what dominated the Christian tradition after Jesus' life. The projection for ultimate justice, the projection for ultimate peace, actually, um, amongst all people on earth, comes about through um, martyrdom and revenge. This is the story of the Gospels. It's in Jesus' words as well as the reaching out to make peace, but it's definitely in his words as well. But it's certainly in the words of Christianity in the second, third, fourth, fifth centuries on, and we have countless heroic Christian figures who are heroes because they were martyred. And our tradition upholds so many martyrs for their willingness to die for um, peace or freedom. Um, but the literary evidence doesn't support it. It shows that our tradition is really invested in that kind of solution. Um, we don't really have evidence outside tiny Christian literary circles about those events of this occurring. It's not to say that it doesn't, it most certainly did it to some extent, but for Christian tradition, it has become the linchpin for um, establishing everlasting peace. Ironically, peace comes through war. Some people believe that is actually how it works, and that's what I'm contesting today. We know that warfare is in both the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, at moments, it is given its blessing by both Christians and by God, too. We know that in many occasions in the early part of the Abrahamic traditions, that idolatry or worshiping in another religion was cause for violence itself. And that is all over our texts. Um, but as Christians, sometimes we want to make a distinction between Old Testament hosting these violent scenes and the New Testament being more compassionate. But I invite you to read your New Testament a little more carefully and your Hebrew Bible more carefully because we have vivid examples of both in both. Revelation, New Testament. Because they poured out the blood of your holy ones and your prophets, now you have given them blood to drink. They get what they deserve. This mentality isn't me reading into the text because all you need to do is take a quick look, and you only need to take a quick look at the eschatology of Christianity today, or the Christianity that feels that publishing or preaching a very detailed eschatology, a view of how things end, is important. And universally, although there are many detailed differences in the many eschatologies out there, there really isn't real difference. Because the Christian eschatology of the day, and unfortunately, I don't think we can pin it all on the evangelicals, but certainly many of them might be willing to take ownership of this. And that is that we have this view of the end that involves horrific worldwide violence and warfare like unseen before. At least that is how the tradition plays it up. We see essentially that there are different versions of the same kind of final conflict. It's so important and significant in Christian eschatology that it's popularized and made believable even in the secular world, so that people think of final conflict as perhaps a sensible end to things or some sort of transformation to a new reality. I don't know, because it's so much in the social psyche. It is also not limited to the United States. Eschatological predictions of violent final conflicts are present in Islam as well, but not as present. This is not a time for us to shift it to Islam or shift it to evangelicals or anything else like that. It is present in our society, and when we speak out against it, it's not aimed at any particular persons or group, but it is a statement of faith that violence will not end violence. Everything in life tells us just the opposite. Violence begets violence every time. So it behooves us to rethink what early Christianity interpreted from Jesus' life and perhaps skipped over because Jesus' martyred life was something that they grieved so much that they turned into a eschatological end where Jesus would get his justice. And they portray Jesus as getting his justice through revenge. Essentially, my thesis on this is that contemporary popular Christian eschatology irresponsibly nurtures war and ensures that we will continue to stand here every year on Memorial Day and grieve the loss of more loved ones in war. It's not enough just to scoff at or play off violent Christian eschatologies where Armageddon and violence and Jesus are inextricably linked. This flies in the face of another kind of Christian faith we can embrace with just as much zealousness. In many circumstances, it is harder to live through it than to die from it. The early Christian mission, I will affirm, and we can affirm, did have some aspect of wanting to achieve a peaceful order through persuasion. This is clear in the book of Acts. We don't see an urging to taking up of arms from the Christian and followers of Jesus in that late first century in the book of Acts. But even though they attempt to do this, it doesn't fly in the rest of the text, and there is a continual repeated anticipation of final conflict. Well, if that wasn't enough, I want to bring us into a close with our last text, our first Hebrew Bible text, Isaiah 47:10, simply says, "You are unconcerned about your cruel acts, and so you said to yourself, no one is watching me. And you have self-professed wisdom of knowledge that leads you astray because you say, I am extraordinary, and no one can compare with me." Now, these were words from the prophet Isaiah that he put in the mouths of the nation of Israel. He wasn't talking about an individual, but a group clearly in his prophecy. And he was saying that their arrogance and saying those things about themselves, their extraordinariness, or that their oppressiveness could be overlooked because no one was really paying attention. The result of this in Isaiah's view is warfare. It is a conflict resolved, again, by warfare, but not between only two people who are warring, but internal conflict was punishable by warfare in the prophetic tradition. Now, I could see where there might be some real sense to that, to where arrogance in nations invites conflict. And we know all too well that our own nation stands as a good candidate for this, going back decades. Let's not focus just on the present. And so these two elements within our social fabric, what I would call a nationalistic arrogance that is shared by the church, nationalistic arrogance that is championed by Christian eschatologies, and a continued insistence that somehow, in spite of the illogic, violence will end violence, and so that the greater the violence, the more decisive the end. I couldn't say no stronger to this idea, and I hope you will too. In closing, another text from Mark. Mark chapter 8, which was read for us at the beginning of the service. Mark 8:35 through 37. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life because of me and because of the gospel will save it. I'm going to do another thing like I did with the previous Gospel of Mark and look at what Matthew and Luke do with the same text. Matthew, really simply, whoever finds his soul will lose it, and whoever loses his soul because of me will find it. I use soul instead of life because that is the word used. Zoe would have been life. They didn't use that. But yes, soul could be interpreted as life. I want to put that ambiguity in there because it further mystifies the text. And then Luke says, whoever wants to, again, save his soul will lose it, and whoever loses his life or soul because of me will save it. So what's missing in there? Mark, the first one to write, says, whoever loses his life because of me, now get this, did you catch this? And because of the gospel. This is supposedly Jesus saying this. It seems not very likely, but it's possible because most historians feel the word gospel was something that came as a word to explain what Jesus was doing and what Christians were doing. In other words, it seems to suggest that Jesus was thinking that not only would it be important to lose your life for my sake now, but for those in the future too, it's worth it. But I'm convinced that it is our martyrological thinking that right away puts into that text this life and death. You know, you're better off dying than living if that's what it takes to lose your life. But in fact, Mark's not really saying that. For he goes on and says, for what benefit is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose his soul in the process? What, he says finally, verse 37, can a person give that shows the value of their life? It's a rhetorical question. We can't. There is in this text the invitation to live with all of our heart and mind. And that after all, that kind of sacrifice, the living sacrifice, is the sacrifice that can most offer us a chance for peace and reconciliation. I'm not dismissing completely the value and the virtue even in one giving their life up for a higher cause. How can you? It happens. But what I am questioning is how much this should be the central anticipation of a good life, or the highest focus that one can achieve in their life. Jesus invites us to live to our fullest, to not let arrogance or revenge be something that takes over our life and lose our soul in that. In other words, the text to me says, in your living, don't lose yourself. In your sacrificial living, don't lose yourself. God calls us to live sacrificially before God calls us to die sacrificially. Shell Ridge Community Church, on this Memorial Day, let us remember the glorious life that God has called us to. One of love and friendship and giving and achieving and growing. We are called to live in such a way that does bring peace to the world. And I beg you to please invest in an approach that doesn't require martyrdom, revenge, or horrific warfare. The way to end warfare and violence is through reconciling, negotiating, peaceful, empathetic understanding. It's not simple. Conflict won't ever completely go away. But let us on this Memorial Day, in honor of those people who have given their lives, stand up for the hope that one day we will be able to live in peace and respect for each other in spite of our differences, because we recognize the inhumaneness of revenge and violence. Shell Ridge, be strong. Be strong in your peacemaking. Be strong in your resistance to violence. And be strong in your positivity. We're not waiting for a horrific, horrible end to pounce upon us. But I do think God is waiting for us to follow in the footsteps of Jesus.